Hello, Tom. The weather's far too dreadful to be outside today, so I'm filming from inside. I liked your point about this foundational axis as an approach to understanding this topic, which ranges from social constructivist and labile in your terminology on the one side, and biologically determinist and more stable on the other. And I agree that this, of course, spills into politics sometimes as well. I suppose it's natural that any argument that sort of draws on human nature or racial differences or differences between the sexes will be informed or reinforced by biologically determinist views. And likewise, it makes sense for politics that draw more on equality-driven agenda to be informed by socially constructivist views. Although, of course, there are also reversals of this, and then I'm thinking of like social Lamarckism, for example, which frames human interaction in terms of cooperation rather than competition. This could be understood as a sort of progressive but biologically informed view, and likewise politics of stuff like cultural homogeneity, where an agenda is to preserve the cultural identity of a place. That's, after all, a conservative but socially constructivist position. So the spectra, social, biological, progressive, conservative, those two spectra don't match up perfectly, but I definitely take your point about how they commonly blend. I suppose as scientists, we, in a way, would rather not that people picked up on what we said in order to use as some sort of political debates. Findings from sociology or evolutionary biology. But I suppose also it's quite, on the other hand, I mean, it's unsurprising that people look to the sciences for answers to big questions like how should we understand human behavior and what makes human society look and function the way it does. And in a way, I guess the problem isn't really in being informed by science to answer those questions, but more when folks do so dishonestly and are perhaps a little bit selective about which arguments they pick up on. And then, I mean, obviously reading a variety of scientific views and then picking the one that matches with your already held opinions. This axis between the socially constructive and the biologically determinative is something I'll get back to later. But first, just a quick note about something you said about different tool sets for understanding evolution. I suppose I disagree that there's a sort of a right way of thinking about evolution. I think that if such a thing as a right way exists, there's probably an awful lot of them which are very context dependent, and I guess you think that also. But yeah, I just wanted to flag that because I think it's important to bear in mind that the sort of questions you ask and the sort of answers you'll get are also very dependent on the context in which you ask and answer them. So to your army of Tom clones that were raised in different families, different countries, different cultures, different places in the world, I'd actually disagree with your prediction that they would present similar behaviours, and I'm sure you anticipated my disagreement. But the fundamental reason I do that is that it doesn't make sense to me to think of behaviour as a canalised trait of development. I'd expect all of these Tom clones to look quite similar, very similar, in fact, in terms of height and appearance and so on, although not entirely identical, because I think some level of plasticity arising from diet or exercise would probably generate some kind of variation. But overall, I'd expect these traits to be pretty robust. I mean, appearance and physical traits and so on. Because it doesn't make sense to me that post-development you'd have enormous levels of plasticity in these traits. And I say post-development because it sounded like you were going to be handing out already cloned baby Toms rather than growing these Tom clones in a bunch of poor women. So yeah, my point is that it doesn't make sense to me that our physical attributes should be enormously plastic, even though I would maintain that there, clearly is some level of plasticity in terms of appearance and looks based on stuff like diet and exercise and so on. However, on the other hand, it does make enormous sense to me that our behaviour post-development would be incredibly plastic. I would consider an evolutionary system that relies on hard-coded behavioural traits to be critically worse than an evolutionary system which facilitates plastic, context-dependent behavioural traits. This makes sense a priori, and I also think that it is what we observe in social animals like humans. And I think it's notable that even your thought experiment had the caveat that you mentioned that the Tom clones might not all share the same taste in music, but they might display similar levels of introversion, for example. But why is that? Why is it that the degree of introversion that an individual is should be any more genetically determined than what kind of music they like? I don't think it really makes sense that either of those should be genetically canalized. So I suppose what my position is that I think extreme plasticity in our behavior is a foundation and a continued requirement for the success of human society. So my prediction would be that if you discretize and categorize human behavior enough in your Tom clone experiment, you might recover some kind of similarities, but I don't think they'd be significant. I mean, in other words, I mean that they'd be essentially type 1 errors arising from you oversaturating your experiment or your analysis with parameters. And the reason I predict this is not sociological but biological in nature. I regard selection acting on our early evolutionary lineage as more likely having been for plasticity in behaviour rather than any particular behaviour in itself. And I mean, of course, at the end of the day, this is just me waffling about an extremely complicated subject. So, of course, I don't really know either. That's the name of the channel. I don't know. But this makes sense to me. That plasticity is what would be selected for itself, rather than any particular behaviour. So, in other words, I regard a dynamic developmental system as more likely to succeed and more likely to have succeeded in our evolutionary lineage than a rigid one, and this brings us back to your spectrum of social constructivism on the one hand, ranging to biological determinism on the other. It follows from my views that our behaviour is socially determined, which of course rhymes with the social constructivist views and correlated politically progressive values and so on. But my understanding of this topic remains biologically informed. So what I wanted to say about your axis is that in a weird sort of paradoxical way, and maybe in fact in a very misleading way, you could argue that the only biological determination going on is that which is generating plasticity in us. So in other words, our developmental systems are dictating that we ought to be plastic. So we can't escape our biologically determined, socially constructivist ways. I suppose that's my attempt at a synthesis of the two completely opposite ends, or end states, as you say, of that axis. And of course, that's not really what people think of when you say biological determinism. But I just wanted to give that to you as a sort of interesting perspective or thought experiment. So I suppose I'll end this vlog now, which has gone on a little bit too long, but I'll end it with a limerick that you reminded me of. That goes like this: There was a young man who said, "Damn, it grieves me to think that I am predestined to move in circumscribed grooves, in fact, not a bus, but a tram? I look forward to your response, Tom. Bye.